Hey folks, how you doing? Good evening. It is Wednesday evening. What is it anyway? I haven't looked at the date for days, it seems. It is the 22nd of May in 2019. And right now, we're going to continue on with the reading of the Exodus Reality. This is a book that was written by John Ward and me back in 2013. And it was published in 2013 by New Page Books, which is now Red Wheel Wiser, but I think they still operate as an imprint of Red Wheel Wiser as New Page Books. And they graciously, after publishing two books of mine, The Rise and Fall of the Nephilim and The Secret History of the Reptilians, as well as an anthology book that I had contributed to, where I contributed an article on the other people, Cain, the son of Adam and Eve, Cain and the other people. And John Ward came here in 2012 and was part of our Paradigm Symposium. And he and I were going to approach my publisher about, which was Michael Pye with New Page Books, about letting us do this book on the Exodus. And I had already given a little spiel to Michael, and we did a proposal, and John came on board. And when he was here from Egypt back in 2012, I remember him standing in the bar during the I think it was for breakfast one morning, where they also served breakfast at the hotel, and was wining and dining Michael Pye. And Michael said, "You guys got the book if you want it." And so we went ahead and we wrote it. And we were given the two color spreads in this, which was unheard of at the time, at least for us. Everything we did, and you can see they're just beautiful pictures in this book. If you're on my Facebook, by the way, that's when that picture was taken. When John and I did this trip, I took a trip. My very first trip to Egypt was January of 2013, and that was to do the research with John for this book. And when I say research, it wasn't like we were sitting down in the libraries or anything like that. We hoofed it. We went everywhere. I was there for almost a month, shy of a couple of days. And John and I, we started in Cairo. And he met me up in Cairo, and we stayed in little hotels. If you remember Tahrir Square, where a lot of the stuff took place in 2011 with the Arab Spring there, a lot of violence there. We were a couple of blocks off of Tahrir Square, and we stayed in a little hotel that he was used to staying in when they traveled out to the Western Desert and up to Alexandria and spent their time in Cairo. And we went all over. He first, of course, took me to the things I needed to see, of course, the pyramids, the Sphinx. We were going to go to the Museum of Cairo that trip to see several areas of the museum that pertain to periods in our book, but they had closed it off because of the violence that had taken place in Tahrir Square. And I remember one day we were driving by the square itself, where you could turn here and you'd enter the square, and there was a bombed out shell of a car all blackened from flames. And so there was a little bit of violence going on there. And I asked John at that time, I said, and questions that have been posed to me many other years when I've gone back since then, is Egypt safe? Is it safe here? John says, if you don't want trouble, you don't go where trouble is. And so that's what he would tell me. And I see Jeff has got a show going at the same time right now, so we might have a little conflict in timing. I try to squeeze this in, so we're in between Rocky Stucci's Situation Room, which I will be on with him at 11 in 2 hours, and anything Jeff is doing, but Jeff just kind of goes as the spirit leads him, I think, so to speak, and he just goes anytime. So the nice thing is we can catch each other's shows in archive. So we'll fill up as soon as Jeff is done doing his topic this evening. And so I spent almost a month in Egypt. And that first trip I was there. And the idea was to go places and see things that I hadn't seen before, but that were part of the story we were trying to compile for our book. We went from Cairo. We went immediately over to the Sinai. which was just driving. If I'm looking at it here on a map, it'd be opposite for you. Where we drove east to the Suez Canal and crossed under the Suez Canal, and we were in the Sinai. And we spent several days there. We were guests of Sheikh Barakat, Salim Barakat. Very stereotypical looking sheikh out in the desert. I mean, he wore the headdress, and he had the big mustache, probably in his early 60s, early to mid 60s. Tough old guy, but he drove a little white Toyota pickup truck. That's how they got around. And so he picked us up, threw us in the back of the pickup truck, drove us out to their compound in the desert. And we went to see the mountain Serabit el-Khadim, which Flinders Petrie, if you are familiar with the archaeologist Flinders Petrie of the early 20th century, he had pretty much set forward the case that he believed Serabit el-Khadim on the western side of the peninsula of Sinai was the mountain of God, the Mount Sinai of the Bible. And it's set in all these craggy mountains and hills where they had all the copper mining, and there was turquoise mining and things like that would go on. And on the top of Serabit el-Khadim, it's a plateaued mountain. There were two temples there, the Temple of Ptah, the Temple of Hathor. And there were just little caves at one end that were built up at one end of the top of this mountain. And successive pharaohs for 1,500 years built little chambers. Think about the size of a garage, a car garage attached to your house, about that size, coming out from those caves, and all the way up to the pharaoh Ramses VI, I think, is the last one in the line. And so we were up there, and it's our belief that Moses, this is where he went. He was in the mountaintop, because when in his early days, as an Egyptian prince of Egypt, high priest of Amun, a general in the army, all the things that he did, all the titles I believe he had, he would had to have gone to Serabit el-Khadim, at least ritually, on one or more occasion. And so we're very sure we traversed the footsteps he took there early in his life, and then of course late in his life when he led the Exodus. And as you will see in this book now, John and I are presenting our two different theories on the Exodus. So when I read John's stuff, it's going to sound very different from my stuff. We have our similarities and our crossovers, but where I need to, I'll make distinction. I won't do as much commentary on John's writing as I'm not in his head. My stuff will be easy. So I've neglected to say good evening to people. Suze, I see you there. Rocky, yo, good to see you, brother. And I'll see you in less than 2 hours. I'm clashing with the whistleblowers, so some may be late coming in. Got it. Yes. Let's see. Who else we got? June, good to see you. Jeannie, nice to see you too. I think, Jeannie, you made some comments last night that I missed. I saw them today, and I can't think of what they were. But suffice it to say, sometimes I get into the reading and I miss the comments. I have to take a time where I just go all the way back through. Rex Bear, Jeffrey D, and Global Witness all at one time. Frame, holy moly. We've all got to either coordinate our schedules or something. That always bothered me about television. Why did they always put my favorite show on CBS when on NBC they were playing my other favorite show? Do they not check with each other? They're all competing for the dollars, I guess. It's like, wouldn't you get more dollars if you just split those up? Didn't compete for the same time slot? And I think the problem, Jeff and Rocky, not so much anymore, that we have with Jeff and some of the other guys is none of us coordinate with each other. So we need to coordinate and just see what's going on with people. Sometimes you just like to free spirit it as well. I try, if I see Jeff is on, I will try to never broadcast unless I've advertised that I'm going on at a certain time. So you've got me on the major speaker there. I feel like I've won the day. So welcome to those of you who are here. we're going to dig into it. I'm not going to wait for anybody else to get here, because if they want to catch up, they'll be able to listen to this in archive, because I want to catch up with where we left off last night in the introduction. And then we're going to move into chapter 1. Now, if you remember in the introduction, I was at a point, I'll cover the last paragraph that I read, and it said, night after night, they ate the meager rations that they carried with them. We're talking about the people who left on the Exodus. And they built fires to keep them warm in the coldness of the desert night. These images of despair and hopelessness are not recanted among the pages of the Old Testament. In fact, it all happened so quickly that we don't even pause to think what it must have been like for them. The happiness and the rejoicing of emancipation from their bondage under the hard fist of the Pharaoh must soon have been replaced by the grieving of the hungry and the cracked rasping of the thirsty. The biblical account in Exodus 14:11 through 12 gives us a little bit of a hint of their condition. And by the way, if you read the Exodus account, the time they spent in the wilderness post Passover and Exodus, leaving Egypt, the years that followed, all they did was grumble and complain. And I think that's a light way of saying they were miserable out there. And they let Moses know it, but none of them returned to Egypt. I'm pretty sure they thought they'd be killed or slapped right back into bondage. The biblical account in Exodus 14 gives us a hint of their condition. In a matter of days, the people were complaining to Moses about how they'd prefer to die in their slave homes back in Egypt rather than in the harshness of the desert wilderness in which they now found themselves. And then there was the passage from Exodus 14. And they said to Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, you brought us all the way out here to die in the wilderness? Wherefore hast thou dealt thus with us, to carry us forth out of Egypt? And isn't that beautiful? The 1611 version of the Bible. Did you know that there are some people that believe that the only God-ordained version of the Bible is the 1611 King James Bible? Why? Why would God not want to be pertinent to every period of mankind and pertinent in the way we talk? So I change it up sometimes when I'm reading it. If I read it in the there's and the whereuntos and wherefores, it is because I'm feeling Shakespearean, and I want to feel poetic. And that reminds me, I'll just tell you, I did some Shakespeare when I was in college, and I had a role of Adriano Di Armado in Love's Labour's Lost, and I also played Antipholus of Syracuse in Comedy of Errors. Every now and then, there's a line that will come back to me, and I remember this. And when I worked at the Renaissance Festival, I used to use some of these lines. It was like this. We did street entertainment out there, and I was the king's sidekick. At the time, he was the prince, I think, and then he became the king out there, and so I became his sidekick. I was Edmund Scroop, the master of horse, and for the king, and we would go out carousing on the street, and he would tell me, and he played a buffoonish kind of prince. He was the very good-looking, ne'er-do-well, drunken, womanizing, charming, yet insincere prince. And I was his sidekick, and I was supposed to keep him in line, but we both kind of did the same thing. So we'd go out on the street, and he'd say, Edmund, he says, there is a woman, he says, teach me to woo. I wish to woo her. Teach me, he says, you are a man of years. I said, I'm not that much older than you, your highness, and this is the kind of thing we did. And so I taught him. He said, how do I woo this woman? And it was a customer like any of you that would be there. And I'd take her hand and I'd say, watch, your majesty. And I'd kiss her knuckle and I'd say, look her in the eyes, your majesty. And you say to her, ah, sweet mistress, what your name is else I know not, nor by what wonder you do hit of mine less in your knowledge and your grace. You show more than earth. You are divine. Speak, dear creature, and I shall dote. Spread o'er the silver waves like golden hairs or red hairs or brown hairs or whatever color hair she had. And there is a bed I'll take them and lie. And in this glorious supposition he thinks, he gains by death that hath such means to die. Let love being light be drowned if she sink. And then I would look, Your Majesty, now do that. And he'd say, oh, Edmund, I don't know. And he'd come up and he'd say, oh, and he'd lick a knuckle. And he'd say, I'd say, no, Majesty, don't lick, kiss the knuckle. And he'd say, oh, the blue of your eyes reminds me of the privy waters where I may relieve myself when my soul is begotten with heaviness and my bowels are full. I said, close, Your Majesty, close. So anyway, that's what that reminded me of. When you read every time I read the King James Version of the Bible, written in 1611, mind you, and if you didn't know this, James I was the first king that was uniting Scotland and England. He was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, who had been beheaded by Queen Elizabeth. And he ended up becoming the king uniting England and Scotland under him. And he was a patron of the arts, and he was a little foppish, if you know what I mean. And he was the one that gave us the 1611 version of the Bible, which was the first Bible that the public masses had in English, where they didn't have to have a priest read it in Latin. And that's because he was Protestant. So there you go. Oh, wait, was King James, was he? I get a little mixed up. Was he? I know Mary was Catholic and Elizabeth was Protestant. And I think it was James. I don't think he reestablished Catholicism as the state religion. I think he remained Protestant, if I am not mistaken. So, back to the Old English. Wherefore hast thou dealt thus with us, to carry us forth out of Egypt? Is not this the word that we did tell thee in Egypt, saying, let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it had been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness. This is what the people are telling Moses. Moses has led them out. You've had all the 10 plagues. You've had the parting of the Red Sea and all these miracles of God. And here they are complaining and saying, take us back to Egypt. We want to go back to Egypt. Such an ingrateful. Now, this is right where we left off last night. I'm going to pick this up. To picture 1,000 campfires lighting up the night sky in one of the many rocky desert valleys conjures emotions that one would not otherwise feel while reading the scripture. Were they afraid of what might lay ahead for them, or were they simply content with just being free? And if they had been slaves for the entirety of their lives, were they terrified at the prospect of what existed along the journey? Again, we turn to the question of familiarity between the children of Israel and Moses and Aaron. Where and how did the trust and bond between the now released Hebrew children of Israel and Moses come from? Well, there wasn't one, I tell you that. One of the questions that remain unanswered is, how many of the participants in Exodus were actually Hebrews or Israelites? We can agree that they were Hebrew by birth, but Egyptian by culture and upbringing. Was Moses seen as a prince of the Egyptian royal family, having turned his back on his adopted mother and family to free the Hebrew slaves? Or was he leading his own people? There were so many people dragging their few possessions through the harsh desert conditions, following a man that had believed would free them and provide them with a new home in the promised land where their forefathers had come from. They must have been aware of the terrifying consequences that befell their Pharaoh at the hands of Moses and Aaron. Was it this fear of the Lord God that drove them and motivated them? Or was it their freedom in the desert that gave them strength? Put yourself into context is the next section. We enter realms of the imagination here, and our minds race with the images of the massive corridor of water, opened, as the scripture says, as a wall on the left and a wall on the right. Exposed coral reefs and sandy plains spanned the pathway from one shore to the other. Few ever questioned the nearly impossible task it would have presented to walk along the exposed wet seabed, not to mention the uneven terrain it must have presented to them. Make no mistake, The accounts of the 10 plagues, the Exodus, the life of Moses were written mostly for the purposes of stirring our hearts and causing shock and awe to our emotions. But that is not to say that the stories are fraudulent, fake, or without historical efficacy. As seems to be the case in antiquity, the more fantastical the tale spun around the basics of a historical event, the easier it is to gain believers. The story of Moses and the Exodus has all the classical trappings of an amazing legend rife with mythological happenings. And frankly, we would love nothing more than to sit back and say, we've discovered that every word in the Holy Scripture is true. What an amazing story that would be. But we know in our hearts that there is something more or less to the stories as we've heard them through the years. We do not question the logistics of such an epic feat. We merely read on with anticipation. The defeat of Pharaoh and his army still whets our appetite for glory. Is it the human emotional response to the story of Exodus that has kept it so vigorously alive? Is it the classic struggle of good versus evil, perceived evil, and the cry for freedom that has stirred the hearts and minds of religious and non-religious believers alike? Even with the advent of film and television, the epic story of the Exodus has been presented to us on the silver screen again, bringing life to the various aspects of the tale, while presenting plausible scenarios in which one finds all at once familiarity that carries us through the unbelievable. No matter how fantastically legendary the story may be, it is believable. With help from all the period costumes and special effects, we're drawn into a world that we could not imagine without reference. In a very real sense, the story of the Exodus, as written down from the oral traditions, became the Lord of the Rings of its day, combining believable people, and in the case of Exodus, real historical characters, with fantastical situations, filled with a brand of myth and magic that leads to great triumph over the forces of evil. Evil. Not evil. It wasn't just evil. It was evil. Only in the case of the Exodus, the God of the universe, who is meant to be shown as a real living force in our lives, was the divinely guiding force. These images now provide the visual reference that millions can draw upon, providing the necessary tools to build a perfect mental picture. A scenario in which the biblical narrative can now take place and become absolutely plausible in the mind's eye. Professor Bauer, how you doing, sir? Good to see you here. Hey, Gene, he says, it goes as if it flows, let it flow, let it blossom, let it grow. Now, next section, this shall be our God. Before we leave the introduction, we want to take you on to one more excursion into the tale of Exodus, the golden calf and the holy mountain of God. It was here upon this mountain of fire that Moses retreats for 40 days to commune with God and receive the first chiseled stone tablets bearing the commandments. It's here that Aaron procures from the children of Israel their pillaged Egyptian gold. Did you know that, by the way? I didn't know that part of the story till later, a little later in my life as I got to be an adult and read in more detail and studied it. They stole all the stuff. They raped and pillaged. They didn't literally rape. They pillaged the Egyptians and raped them financially. And the Egyptians were like, here, take it. Just get out. And so they had all this Egyptian gold from which Aaron fashions a golden calf to represent their God who led them out of bondage and to which they can give worship in the absence of Moses. It is this singular event that reminds us just how Egyptian these Hebrews really were. After all, the works and wonders of the Lord of God they had seen displayed, from the plagues to the parting of the Red Sea, they still create a false idol to worship a mere 2 weeks into the Sinai desert. The golden calf scenario brings us to question the foundation and upbringing of the Moses family. Were they indeed Hebrew or were they Egyptians? The question of blood heritage versus national identity will be asked many times over, especially when dealing with the incorporation of implements of worship, such as the infamous Ark of the Covenant and its attributed chattels. Together we'll explore the ancient temple of Sarabit el-Khadim, which I already spoke with you about, our trip there. Located in the southeastern deserts, it's actually it's more south-central deserts of the Sinai Peninsula, close to the shores of the Red Sea, near what is now known as the mouth of the Suez Canal. This temple complex has a rich history reaching far back into the epochs of Egyptian history. Primarily, this was a place of worship for the goddess Hathor, the cow goddess of fertility and growth. Is it synchronistic that this temple is located in the very spot where the trade routes of the Sinai converge? Would it be inconceivable to suggest that these ancient Egyptian trade routes would have existed at the time of the Exodus? And would it be presumptuous to suggest that the golden calf that Aaron fashions be one and the same as Hathor? Is this what he was making? After all, by the way, Sarabit el-Khadim is the patron god of the mountain, is Hathor. And Hathor was the patron goddess to the miners who worked in all the mountains around them. The one and the same as Hathor, and that the released Hebrew slaves who were by de facto Egyptian in their culture and upbringing were, of course, more than familiar with the traditions and ceremonial customs of Hathor. Could this be the reason why Aaron allowed this religious transgression to take place? While rewriting the Old Testament, the 72 Judaic scholars of the Ptolemaic period saw an opportunity to demonstrate that the Lord God was indeed a jealous God, and that the worship of any other god or deity was considered a sin, and therefore punishable by death. When Moses returned from the mountain, carrying with him the first tablets of the law, he threw them to the ground in a fit of righteous anger at the reckless regression of the children of Israel. Moses then took the golden calf and burned it in the fire until it was consumed, grinding its charred remains and scattering it upon the water supplies, according to Exodus 32, 16-21, ordering that the errant Hebrews drink that same water. It is written with the same chapter. It is within the same chapter that 3,000 Hebrews were slain, and the remaining Hebrews who sinned against the Lord God would be plagued on the day of punishment by the Lord God, akin to a sacrifice to atone for the sins of the people, all at the site of the Temple of Hathor in western Sinai. The end of the beginning is the next section. Normally, within an introduction to a book, one sets out the reasons for the forthcoming chapters and lays out the theories, the ideas, and thought processes behind the authors, ending with a conclusion. The conclusion of our introduction is simple, and yet conflicting at the same time, as we did not set out on this journey free of worries or trepidation. It was not an easy decision to make. On the one hand, both Scotty and John are Christian in their upbringing, both having the Bible taught to them from an early age. Scotty entered Bible college and theological seminary, while John works and lives on the very site of the ancient city of Thebes, where Moses walked, and from which the Exodus burst into history. I actually believe it was Memphis, up in the north, but we'll leave that go in the text here. We argued about that. So both of us have entered this hall of questions with a preconditioned thought process and a preconditioned set of parameters with which we had to come to terms in order to outline our ideas and thoughts as presented here. And we had to do this all without taking a definitive point of view, standing in a sort of biblical neutral zone that will most probably bear its own weight of critical response. It is our hope that the theories, hypotheses, notions, and suggestions will help you come to a better understanding of the narrative employed in the Bible, thereby allowing you to travel alongside those ancient people who sought freedom, salvation, and a place they could call home. After all is said and done, we all desire a place that we can call home, where we can raise our children in peace and safety, grow old and watch our children marry and raise their own children, perpetuating the never-ending cycle of humankind. Now it's time to enter the following chapters with a clear and open mind, understanding that sometimes the things we deem as truth may sometimes be only the glorified stuffs of myth and legend, On the other hand, many of the things we may have considered to be far too fantastical to accept as fact or truth may just be at the end of the core, may be at the core of what is the most relevant and real parts of the story. So the mission is set forth. It's our contention that the Exodus, in all its reality, is more than mere religious mythology or exaggerated happenstances blown into epic proportions. It is the tale based on a true story of the apocalyptic migration of an integrated people that followed on the heels of catastrophic events. And now, let us take you on a journey into the past and show you how it really happened. That's the end of the introduction. We're going to jump right from that into chapter 1, which I remember when I was editing parts of this. Some of this is on all of this stuff you're reading. Some of it is John's paragraphs, some of it is mine, some of it I've taken. I rewrote John's stuff. That's where John and I, we launched a little joke between us in 2013. He said, "So, brother, what did you think of my paragraphs, my pages?" I said, "Well," I said, "they're good." I said, "But you're no Hemingway." And so that's become our constant joke. I would tell John on anything, well, that's good, but you're no Hemingway. So all of this stuff is mixed now, and we wrote, both of us wrote these chapters that aren't to do with our particular theories together. And then when we get to our theories, we go chapter after chapter, we crisscross over, and we say this is the Senenmut thread, or this is the Hapu thread, Hapu being John's theory, Senenmut being mine. All right. We all still with me? Hey, James Sheets, how you doing? Michelle, good to see you. Let's see, who else is here who may have come in while I was reading? Suze, you've already been here. Janice, Lola Joy, good to see you. Let's see. I'm Mr. Bauer, of course, Professor Bauer. I didn't see you come in, but I see that you're here. Nice to have you, brother. And I see some discussion going on there. So let's just move forward. Hemingway was your husband's fave. That's good. I like Hemingway. I kind of emulate him a little bit, all the way until the suicide part. So let me take a sip of coffee and we'll move on. Great to be seen, Michelle. Thank you. All right. Chapter 1, an Anthro-Archaeological perspective. Now it's 9:30. We've got a show in an hour and a half. So I think we'll be able to wipe out chapter 1 tonight if I don't get too stuck in my own rabbit trailing. So here we go. It is, I believe it's 20 pages long. Very close. Tip your head back. No, I really want you to do this. I want you to soak this in. I wrote this for a reason. Tip your head back. Close your eyes and breathe deep the air around you. It's filled with the aromas of your life and environment. Sometimes the things we take in so subconsciously, such as the scent of our homes, the leather upholstery in our automobile, the oven in the kitchen, the soapy smell of the clothes dryer exhaust, and the scent of hewn grass wafting in through the open summertime windows, blending with the sound of passing garbage trucks, sirens, and children playing in the background. Now imagine your senses being transported to another time and another place, where the air is arid and dry and hot, with only the faintest hint of moisture filling your nostrils as the massive Nile waters roll slowly by, evaporating into the air around you. The scent of water, fish, and papyrus reeds bending in the mild breeze from their place in the marshy patches leading up to the river's edge fill your nostrils with the sweet, pungent odor of green. In the distance, carrying on the ever so faintly incensed air, blending into the warm dustiness of the low, melancholic minor-keyed melodies of the priestly chants, mixed with the sounds of the bustling city life echoing off the stone structures. Cheers and joyous shouting are raised into the mix as the pharaoh rides his chariot along the processional way, which, by the way, if you saw the image for tonight's show, the front image, That was John and I walking up the Avenue of Sphinxes toward the gate of Luxor Temple. That avenue in just the last few years has been uncovered. It runs in a straight line from the gates of Luxor Temple in front of us in that picture, 3.5 miles in a straight line behind us to the gates, the back gates of Karnak Temple Complex. And it jogs around a little bit around the gate, but it was lined, that whole 3.5 miles was all paved with stone, as you see in that picture, and it was all lined with sphinxes, about 8 to 12 foot long sphinxes, all on their own pedestals, every 8 feet, all the way down on both sides of that avenue, 3.5 miles down. So, the sound of bustling city life, so on. Cheers and joyous shouting are raised into the mix as the pharaoh rides his chariot along the processional way. Throngs of people crowded along the route, in and around and atop the sphinxes lining the avenue. The smell of kitchen fires, baking bread, boiling stews of oxen mix with the smells of roasting geese, leeks, garlics, and onion. A cacophony of sensuality greets you, and when you open your eyes to that first blinding white of the desert sun, the city is bathed in bright light, glistening above the sparkling waters of the River Nile. Any good story relies not only on its characters, but also on the setting in which they're placed. Likewise, qualitative study on any topic from antiquity needs a good reference point, a stage on which to block the characters who move in and throughout the play, establishing the life and deeds of such enigmatic figures as Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, and their more than probable connection to the royal houses of 18th dynasty Egypt, is possible only by taking an acute, intrinsic look at the stage whereupon they acted out their destinies. It is our intention to establish not only the circumstantial evidence that links these biblical protagonists and antagonists to real history, but to remove their Sunday school pageant bathrobe and bedsheet costumes, raising them out of the relegated storybook myth and legend to stand openly and unabashedly on the stage of human history within the walls of temples and palaces of ancient Egypt. So before we can even begin exploring the various evidences, ideas, suggestions, and theories that we wish to present, we felt it appropriate to pull back the heavy velvet curtain, walk you to center stage, and begin taping off the players' marks on the stage floor. As the backdrop unfurls behind you and the flats of history roll into place on stage left and right, use your imagination and let us transport you from whatever chair, sofa, bed, or bench you now find yourself on to the banks of the sun-sparkled waters of the River Nile and one of the 18th dynasty Egypt's ancient capitals, Thebes, the bustling, magnificent river city of the pharaohs, where the temple of Luxor was referred to in ancient times as Ipit Resit, the southern sanctuary. Located in Middle Egypt, some 400 miles south of modern-day Cairo and 118 miles north of Aswan, sandwiched between the western and the eastern deserts, with the Theban mountain range hovering over the western boundary, Thebes embraces the many secrets and epic legends that it has witnessed over the centuries. By the way, this is the city of Luxor, ancient Thebes as it appears today, rising around the Temple of Luxor. You don't see much of the city in this, but when you get off the ferry boat from the West Bank where John lived, the ferry boats come right to the Temple of Luxor. And all there is this very busy street that I'm standing in to take this picture. And behind me is the waterfront and the Nile. So there's the gates to Luxor Temple, which spreads out behind the gates there. So that's modern day Luxor. Although the city of Thebes was home to the Egyptian monarchy in the New Kingdom, it's difficult to understand how Moses interacted and traveled between the Pharaoh in Thebes and the Hebrews in Goshen, which was up in the Nile Delta, 400 plus miles to the north, in the northern Nile Delta. According to Genesis 49, 9 through 10, when Joseph, the son of Jacob, was made vizier in Egypt some 400 years prior to the events of the Great Exodus, as the Bible tells us, which is a skewed number, by the way, he relocated his Canaanite family to the land of Goshen, which has been placed in the delta region of the Nile, to the east of present-day Cairo and the fertile, marshy expanse of the Wadi Tumilat. And there, throughout the next 4 centuries, or bits and pieces of 4 centuries, it's kind of like when they say that the Hebrews dwelt in the land of Egypt in slavery for 400 years, I think it just means from the time Joseph set foot there till the time they left with Moses, bits of 4 centuries, 2 full centuries, and a little bit of a third on the front end, a little bit of a fourth on the back end. Just kind of like they do the 3 days and nights in the tomb at Jesus' birth. He's crucified on Friday, risen on Sunday. That sounds like 2 nights to me, not 3 days. And it was called 3 days because it was a part of a day. Same kind of thinking. And Joseph relocated his Canaanite family to the land of Goshen, which has been placed in the Nile Delta. It's the fertile, marshy expanse of the Wadi Tumilat. And there, throughout the next 4 centuries, or the time that the Hebrews dwelt there, the family of Jacob, about 70 people when they first arrived, grew into the vast number of Hebrews, eventually enslaved by the Pharaoh, who, according to Exodus 1:8, had no regard for Joseph. The big question is, if the Pharaoh and his family primarily lived in Thebes, how could he interact with the representatives of the Hebrews, who were living and working 400 miles to the north in Goshen? He could, if there was some historical credence to the idea that the royal family moved back and forth between Thebes, the capital, and Memphis, the religious center. Its logistical proximity to Goshen would certainly open the door for 2 glaring points in biblical story. 1, the mention that Moses' birth mother, Jochebed, sent him down the Nile in a basket, eventually ending up in the pools of the royal palace. That could not have happened at the palace in Thebes, especially if the Hebrews lived 400 miles north in Goshen. Distance notwithstanding, keep in mind that the Nile River flows north toward the Mediterranean Sea, not south toward Thebes and Luxor. The city of Memphis, however, stood in the region just west of Goshen and north of present-day Cairo. It was filled with Nile River canals intersecting all over the place. So the Hebrews were just down the canal, and 80 years later, when Moses and Aaron confronted the Pharaoh, demanding the release of the Hebrew slaves, the monarch is said to have angered at their insolence and issued an edict that the Hebrews would have to go find their own straw for their brick making. This would have been unlikely were he at the royal palace in Thebes, while the Hebrews' brick-making operation was in Goshen. That was the capital of brick-making back then, by the way. Without the convenience of video conferencing or Moses possessing an iPhone, the Pharaoh would need to be in some close proximity to the slaves' base of operations. So the plot thickens. Thebes or Memphis? We'll examine this in much deeper detail later in these pages. And by the way, Goshen, off to the east of Cairo in the Nile Fan, that delta region, this is where it is said that Ramses II built his treasure cities of Pithom and Ramses, or Pi-Ramses, which we've excavated. And what people throw off, people will cover this more in the Bible. I don't think Ramses had anything to do with the Exodus. I think he was 150 years too late, his birth, for the Exodus. And we'll get into that later in the book. But he built his cities of Pithom and Ramses, Pi-Ramses, on top of an older city, it's been discovered, of Avaris, which is the city that is rife with archaeological evidence of Canaanite culture, of Semitic culture having dwelt there. So it is now believed that Avaris was the big slave city of Goshen. And they found a palace there that matches the description to the T of the palace of Joseph, who was the Grand Vizier of Egypt when he first brought his family to Egypt. And the palace matches, and many other things and details. We'll get into that as we go. So the pharaonic seat of Egypt. Thebes was a city of ancient splendor, a beautiful artistic center that was the jewel of Egyptian royalty and spirituality, whose east bank was the celebration of light, life, and living mortals, while its west bank was an equal celebration of death, eternity, and the immortals. Nowhere does there seem to be a settlement of common slaves near this immaculate city. Thebes was set in a spiritually charged landscape, and the question of communication between Moses, Pharaoh, and the Hebrews is brought to bear by simple logistics on a map of ancient Egypt. And the absence of a major slave population's expansive settlement in this cultural heart of the kingdom. It says in Exodus 5, 1 through 12, I'm going to read this. And afterward, Moses and Aaron went in and told Pharaoh, "Thus said the Lord God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast unto me in the wilderness." And Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and to let Israel go?" I always hear Yul Brenner. "Who is this God," he says, "that I should obey his voice?" And he says, and let Israel go. He says, "I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go." And they said, "The God of the Hebrews hath met with us. Let us go, we pray thee, 3 days' journey into the desert, and sacrifice unto the Lord our God, lest he fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword." Now, I think it's interesting that the first presentation that Moses makes, God has asked Moses to go deliver my people. I have heard their voice. They have cried to me from bondage. Go set them free. And here's Moses. He's kind of lying to Pharaoh. And, we're just gonna go out for 3 days and worship God. He might kill us if we don't. So let us go, please. We'll be back. I don't think Pharaoh bought that. And the king of Egypt said unto them, "Wherefore do ye, Moses and Aaron, let the people from their work?" In other words, he's saying, what the hell are you doing? Why are you taking the people away from their work? Get you unto your burdens. And Pharaoh said, "Behold, the people of the land now are many, and you make them rest from their burdens." And Pharaoh commanded that same day the taskmasters of the people and their officers, saying, "You shall no more give the people straw to make brick, and heretofore let them go and gather straw for themselves. And the tale of the bricks which they did make before you shall lay upon them. You shall not diminish aught thereof, for they be idle. Therefore they cry, saying, Let us go and sacrifice to our God. Let there be more work laid on them, upon the men, that they may labor therein, and let them not regard vain words." And the taskmasters of the people went out, and their officers, and they spoke to the people, saying, "This is what Pharaoh said, I will not give you straw. Go you and get your own straw where you can find it. Yet none of your work shall be diminished. You still have the tallies to meet." So the people were scattered abroad throughout all the land of Egypt to gather stubble instead of straw. All right. So now to make mud bricks, you needed straw. That's why they would stamp them in the mud pits, mix the straw in. There's a picture in this book. I got to show this to you. You may have seen it on my Facebook page. But John and I spent a little time making mud bricks near Luxor. Let me find it for you. I got to show you this. Here it is. I'm going to save my place with my finger. You see that picture right there? We say we're in the mud pit. It's a local mud brick maker. They make them the same way they used to. It's just mud and straw. And we were smoking cigars and having coffee, I'm sure just like the Hebrews did. So, hey, Audrey. So, there's what happened. Pharaoh said, you pissed me off. Now, you're coming in here and you're asking the people to go. They must not have enough work to do. If they're idle enough to listen to you and ask for time off, you know what? Same amount of bricks are due, and now you can do it without us providing the straw. You go find it yourself. So, was it from the palace at Thebes, all the way down 400 miles south, that Pharaoh Tutmosis I, Amenhotep II, or even Amenhotep III issued angry edicts for the Hebrews? the Hebrew babies to be killed, or their tally of bricks to be increased, and their labors to be harshened by the gathering of their own straw? Or was there a connection to the northern city of Memphis, which lay in close proximity to Goshen, or Avaris, which is the city in Goshen? The necessity of these questions weighs heavily upon the substance of a latter part of this book, where we examine the physical logistics of a biblically recorded mass migrational exodus of what would have had to have been, by the biblical accounting, nearly 1.5 million slaves overnight. That didn't happen from Thebes to where they lived in Goshen. Perhaps Thebes, being the political, cultural, and spiritual capital of Egypt, gave accommodation, diplomatic immunity, and possibly even some sort of governmental housing to the new faces of the Hebrew slave population, Moses and Aaron, as well as the Hebrew taskmasters and officers. But at this point in these pages, there's a need to engage in less speculation and more digging into the historical efficacy of both places. Today, the city of Thebes goes by the name of Luxor, or Luxor, as the French named it during their occupation. Separated by the River Nile as it winds its way northward toward the Mediterranean, the East Bank is home to the main city with hotels, restaurants, and other tourist trappings that one would expect of such a historic center that has catered to numerous visitors throughout the past 2,000 plus years. But more importantly, it is home to Karnak, Ipet Isut, known as the world's largest open-air museum. Hidden behind its crumbling walls, there are ancient secrets and ceremonial practices that glorified the divine. Theban triad only known to the high priests that walked its glorious halls and who bathed in the coolness of the sacred lake that lies within its heart. It is connected by a sphinx-lined avenue that was once trodden by the feet of the pharaohs of the ancient Egypt. Today, this processional route lies in a sad state of ruin, but still manages to inspire and awaken those emotions of grandeur and pompous ceremony that it once enjoyed. And by the way, when I was there in 2013, the Japanese were working on the Avenue of Sphinxes, that 3.5-mile stretch between the two temples. And I believe it's all been restored as of now. The avenue terminates at the Temple of Luxor, Ipet Reiset, a truly magnificent structure built by various pharaohs that eventually succumbed to the Roman occupation. It once housed a beautiful basilica, which now holds the Mosque of Abu Hagag, allowing this sacred location to continue as a place of worship and pilgrimage. Let me show you a couple of pictures that are in the color section. This, by the way, is we're here in this picture in the Karnak Temple complex. That's me in the blue shirt and John in the me in the Humphrey Bogart hat and John in the Indiana Jones hat. That's looking down one of the main lanes, side lanes of the Temple of Karnak. And remember the picture I told you about, the Avenue of Sphinxes? This is what it looked like. Here, and I've got to show you this. Before it spans 2 pages here. I'll show you this way. This is where it'd be nice to be able to project this. That picture on the bottom, that right there is the Avenue of Sphinxes. You see the Sphinxes along this side and along the opposite side. That's John and I walking toward the gates of Luxor Temple. And looks like the beginning of a beautiful friendship. So that was our walk down the Avenue of Sphinxes at the Luxor Temple end. So that gives you an idea. All right, let's get back to reading. Page 54 I left off. Here we go. Both of the temples would have figured heavily into the Exodus story, yet they are remiss from the biblical narrative. It is not inconceivable to suggest or imagine that in the formative years of Moses' youth, he would have walked upon the very stone slabs that so many tourists tread today. The view would have not been that dissimilar within the confines of the pillared halls, with the constant sound of wooden hammers against metal, while water boys dealt refreshing Nile water to the stonemasons as they carefully and gently carved the seams of the Opet festival. But at the same time, Moses would have enjoyed the company of its incumbent priests with their freshly shaven heads and their flowing white robes, listening intently to their words of wisdom and knowledge as they recited the sacred stories of the gods to him, and in doing so, preparing Moses for his royal duties that one day he would have to perform. The West Bank is home to the ancient Theban necropolis, the land of the dead, where they rest peacefully within their tombs, emblazoned with sacred texts from the Book of the Dead, while their Ka traveled freely among the living, visiting their earthly homes and loved ones they left behind, eating and drinking as if life was an eternal pleasure. It is here we find the infamous Valley of the Kings and the sprawling stone mortuary temples of various pharaohs that line the western desert's edge, now preserved piles of stone, resembling a mere fraction of their original grandeur. The lonely doorways now provide access to empty spaces, but once were beautifully decorated chambers, adorned by handcrafted furniture and the colorful fabrics. If one could pause for a moment, it's easy to imagine the sweet smell of burning incense as it passed from chamber to chamber, filling the voids with the aromatic odors of the east, their gentle smoke being highlighted by shards of penetrating light that break through the small carved windows. One such temple is the magnificent mortuary temple of Jesher-Jesheru in Deir el-Bahre, built by Hatshepsut under the hand of appointed chief architect Senenmut. The never-ending cycle of temple life included delivery after delivery, making its way through the huge sycamore doors with heavy bronze hinges encrusted with green oxidization. Massive lion-headed bolts were drawn back to allow the steam of men in their donkey-driven carts carrying the necessary supplies of grain, fruits, and precious oils. Behind them were the livestock, many of which were required for the daily offerings within the ceremonial and rites and rituals that were performed for the deities that the deceased owner of the temple complex. By the way, this is a black and white picture of Jesher-Jesheru. This is Hatshepsut's funerary temple. There it is. And I also have, and one of my favorite places, by the way, right behind those mountains. These are the Theban mountains. This is nestled on the east side of the mountain range. And if you go just right over the top of these crags, you're in the Valley of the Kings. And this is where she built her temple. And I do have a color picture of that I'll share with you right here, because I think it's cool. Let's see, let's find it. Right here. I've got her statue from the temple, one of her many statues from the temple, superimposed on the front. But there you see, as we were climbing up to the cliffs, we were climbing up to see the workers' cave, and I'll tell you more about that later. But this is the scene from the cliffs to the north side of her temple compound there, as we were climbing up, and I took that picture of her temple. And this is one of the statues. If you look at the pillars, there was one of these statues in front of every one of those pillars. And you can see a few of them down there in the lower sections. And that's Hatshepsut. That is the female pharaoh. And these were all brightly painted in color. So, all right. Let's see where I left off here. The cottage industry that produced all that was required for the easy running of the temple was constantly busy. The kitchens were always preparing and serving meals to those who had spent the morning laboring in the fields, or to the priests who had just finished their first set of daily rituals. But these are nowhere near as tremendous as the feast that was being laid out before the visiting god on his offering table, later to be shared among the temple staff and their families once the deity had satisfied its hunger. The weavers and their apprentices spun yard after yarn of fine cloth and linen in preparation of the ongoing mummification process that took place regularly. The embalming workshops requirement for their supply of sacred linen never abated. It's not a huge leap to place Moses, Aaron, and Miriam into such a scene. It is worth mentioning that the name of these temples translates as House of millions of years. It was the belief that their architects, that the dead pharaoh would travel back and forth from the underworld to visit his earthly house, hence the name. As we previously mentioned within the introduction, ancient Egypt is familiar as the dark side of the moon, and rightly so in many aspects. Archaeologically speaking, there is an immense wealth of material pertaining to ancient Egypt and its people. Universities, libraries, and museums across the world have amassed huge collections of Egyptian artifacts that span thousands of years, not to mention the Grand Egyptian Museum. In pop cultural terms, other than the famous tomb of Tutankhamun, the Sphinx, and the pyramids, not much is really well known or talked about. The silver screen has portrayed ancient Egypt in many guises, from the mid-20th century old black and white films of Boris Karloff as the Mummy, to the action-packed adventures of Indiana Jones and his conquests across the world of antiquity. And let's not forget the recent adventures of the Mummy trilogy, in which we see significantly important ancient names, such as Imhotep, come to life in front of us, performing rites and ceremonies that quite possibly bear some resemblance to the ancient events. Ever since the first early European travelers began to navigate the Nile, tales of Egypt's rich history began to filter their way back to mainland Europe, conjuring images related to the age-old stories such as Arabian Nights, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, and of course the biblical narrative. Napoleon's somewhat forced occupation of Egypt during the later parts of the 18th century led to the great scientific exploration of ancient Egypt's history. His team of scholars, draftsmen, and engineers scoured the Egyptian countryside, recording and documenting all that lay in their paths. We have so much to thank Napoleon and his scientific team for. If they had not been so disciplined in their work, we would not know as much as we do today. It was his team's discovery of the famous Rosetta Stone that eventually led to the decipherment of ancient and lost hieroglyphic language by Jean-Francois Champollion in 1822, showing the academic world that the ancient text was a mixture of phonetic and ideographic signs. As Egypt's population grew, so did its cultivation of land and the subsequent reclamation of its ancient sites to make way for the necessary housing and industry that was growing within her. Many of Egypt's glorious sites were being lost to the internal growth that flourished with its fame in the international stage. Egypt had always played a strategic part in colonial military maneuvers, but once more, it was her history that brought with it European wealth and a necessity to renew its aging, somewhat dilapidated cities. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the great discoveries began to make headline news around the world, and treasures beyond the imagination began to appear. Golden chariots, death masks made from encrusted jewels and precious metals, everyday household objects that were familiar to the crowds, entire chambers full of immeasurable wealth that far outweighed anything Europe's aging monarchies had to offer or could match in such splendor and opulence. It was during this time that the Egyptomania gripped the public's imagination. But behind the scenes, there was also a flurry of activity among the eminent archaeologists and Egyptologists as they raced to uncover artifacts and evidence that substantiated the biblical stories, searching for all those all-important clues in the dusty ancient tombs as Egypt's glorious past was being sold at rapid rate to the highest bidder. Huge caches of artifacts in wooden crates were being loaded upon steam-driven ships at Port Said and Alexandria to be transported back to Europe and beyond by unscrupulous middlemen who acted as agents for the universities and aristocratic houses, all gripped by the Egyptomania bug, hoping to find a lost treasure hidden in the sands of Egypt, or find a clue as to the whereabouts of the stolen Ark of the Covenant by Pharaoh Shishak. Many a myth and legend were being analyzed to find the scantiest truth and locate those clues in the temples and tombs of the ancients, hopefully hidden within the colored reliefs and hieroglyphic writings. It was a time when Egypt was truly plundered by the Europeans. Of course, Luxor was by no means an exception. It was here that many a young aristocratic man or woman came to take part in the illegal excavations, hoping to find an artifact that would secure his or her financial freedom. The West Bank was a flurry of activity. No matter where you looked, there was an excavation of one kind or another taking place within the solemn tunes, to the solemn tunes of the workers singing as they dug, removing centuries of sand and debris that had accumulated. Let's see. Who does Egyptian history credit? Oh, that jumped up here. Let me see. It looked like a question about what we're reading. What or who does Egyptian history credit its beginnings, its progenitors? Are you talking about the source of life in Egypt, Professor Bauer? I think that's a mixed bag. We're going to get into that a little bit in this book, not too deeply. But many thought they came from Ethiopia. Many thought they were, as Robert Bauval suggested, the Black Egyptians, or the just to the south, Ethiopians. The Nubian peoples that moved in. Others, I'm not sure where they think they came from. They certainly didn't migrate from Canaan or Mesopotamia to get down there. So if Mesopotamia is indeed the Euphrates River Valley, the cradle of civilization, if that's where mankind first appeared on the scene, as we used to believe when I was a kid, I know it was taught the cradle of civilization, I don't think that's where they came from. I believe they all came out of Africa, as Egypt is, of course, in northern Africa. So you're looking at the Black Africans, or the Black Egyptians. Black Genesis by Robert Bauval. Yes, that's a good book. That's a good read. All right. Here we go. Let's carry on. Sink your feet into the ancient sands. So, what was ancient Thebes like for Moses when he lived there during his first 40 years as the adopted son of a royal princess? He was an Egyptian prince in all but name. Did he have all the freedoms and associated attributes that were customary to a royal prince of that time? And by the way, you can tell John wrote this paragraph because I believe that he was given the title of hereditary high priest, or hereditary crown prince of Egypt. So this is where you will see some of the subtle differences in the things we talk about as we write, even the blender passages in this book that deal with the generalities. And Sumerian that had the first written documents. Yes, that's right, Jeannie, that we know of. So as the authors have two opposing theories, the landscape of the Theban necropolis looks different to both of us. John's theory is attached to the prolific building of the megalithic structures that took place during the reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, which changed the entire landscape forever. Scotty's theory belongs to that of a time when Pharaoh Hatshepsut walked among the living gods. Her grand temple clung to the Theban mountains, its terraces adorned with huge statues proclaiming her rightful status as pharaoh, remembering that she was indeed a female and not a male heir. However, these two periods of Egyptian history, separated by less than a mere 100 years, were considerably different in their settings. Military conquests, internal conflicts, and expeditions that flooded the land of Egypt with exotic goods, some of which had never before been seen, were all playing their parts in the development of these two opposing periods. The sheer wealth of Egypt was beginning to show through its pharaoh's ambitious building programs, all of which were dedicated to glorifying and praising the gods for their protection and blessing that they had bestowed upon the people of Egypt. If we amalgamate the two opposing eras within the Egyptian history and present that collective map to you, It should make things a lot easier. No matter what era in which we place Moses, be that the time of Pharaoh Ramses II, which the authors agree is nearly 2 centuries too late on the timeline, or Amenhotep III, he still would have stood in the halls of Karnak, or on the foot of the terraced temple of Hatshepsut, as well as her small temple dedicated to Amun at Menedot Habu. And as a matter of fact, at Menedot Habu, it's there in Luxor, Thebes. It's if you walked it by foot across the desert floor, 20 minutes to a half an hour, 5 minutes by car to get to Hatshepsut's temple, and 10 minutes to get it all the way around the edge of the Theban mountain over by where John Carter built his house, and to the entrance of the Valley of the Kings on the other side. You have the Valley of the Nobles is in between there. It's all laid out right there. And I remember saying to John, as we were walking into the temple of Menedot Habu, which, by the way, I mentioned that temple in one of my books when we were talking about the Ogdode and the Egyptian religion that said the creation of the world took place on that mound where that temple was built, according to Egyptian religion. We were crossing over that threshold into the holy place. And I looked down and I said to John, I said, look at this paving stone and how worn it is from the thousands of years of people walking on it. And I said, imagine the characters we're writing about, Moses. His feet would have touched this stone, no matter who he was, which one of our guys he was, he would have been at this temple. And that's what made it very interesting to be there. Let's see, where did I leave off? The flood of the land of exotic goods. If we amalgamate the two opposing eras, it's Amenhotep II, Ramses, the Temple of Hatshepsut, the Valley of the Kings. It is plausible that Moses once stood on the Giza Plateau and gazed at the wonder of his adopted ancestors' building achievements, the Great Pyramids, and placed an offering at the paws of the Great Sphinx. It was at Saqqara that his possible adopted uncle, Crown Prince Tutmosis, participated in the sacred Apis bull ritual with Pharaoh Amenhotep III. It would be wonderful to think that Moses once stood shoulder to shoulder with his uncle at that ceremony and possibly participated as a royal family member with all its rites, then destroying a similar effigy in of the deity upon the fires at the foot of the holy mountain approximately 40 years later. And that's another thing about the golden calf and the Apis bull. We'll get into some of the comparisons there as well. During that period, there were no luxuries such as concrete and steel bridges that afforded one safe crossing of the River Nile, nor had the motorboat been introduced with its petrol-driven outboards. You can tell who wrote that sentence, with its petrol-driven outboards. We say gas in America. One would have to pay the ferryman his due or live and work on one side of the river, only crossing when truly necessary, taking great care as to not wander too close to the Nile's edge, for lurking just beneath its murky waters, the Nile crocodile patiently waited for its next victim. It was not until the opening of the Aswan Dam in 1971 that the crocodiles eventually vanished from the Egyptian River Nile banks. As a matter of fact, when we're at Gebel El Silsila, we all jump off the boat and into the Nile to cool off. There's no crocodiles there today. They're all down south of us in Aswan. Ceremonial practices took place along the Nile's edge to appease the Nile crocodile, personified as the god Sobek, the crocodile-headed deity that many a temple has been erected for in Egypt. It was considered a great honor to die in the crushing jaws of Sobek, although I'm sure while you're being gnawed apart by the jaws of a crocodile, you weren't praising Sobek more than you were screaming. However, it was probably not that honorable for the victim. During this period of history, the Nile was pivotal to the very existence of Thebes, its life-giving waters feeding the canals, which in turn irrigated the vast agricultural land that stretched along the flatlands. When the Nile flooded, it deposited its mineral-rich black sediment, giving Egypt one of its nicknames, the Black Lands. It was the ancient Greek historian Herodotus who stated that Egypt is the gift of the Nile, a sentiment that could not be closer to the truth. By the way, as I'm thinking about this, if you've got Google Earth or just Google Maps, go to Google Earth and zoom in on Luxor, Egypt, and look at the boat landing. There's one main boat landing there. You'll see the temple on the east bank of Luxor and the boat landing there. And the opposite side of the river is the small town on the west bank, full of shops and locals and so on, and all kinds of people living out there. There's banana plantations and things like that out there. I once took the Google Earth and I was able to trace the sidewalk and the road and the dirt path down to John and Maria's house over on the west bank. So it's fun to look at if you want to get your bearings here. You can look at the temples from the sky, from the satellite shots. Standing on the east banks of the River Nile during the New Kingdom, 14th to 19th dynasties, 1550 to 1069 BC, looking toward the west bank, one would be greeted by a secondary island directly in front of where one is standing. This island gave its name to the village in which John lives today, Gezeret, meaning islands in Arabic. Beyond this island, one would have been confronted by a series of complex canals fed directly by the Nile, denoted by their flagpoles and landing stations, so they could still be navigated and used during the Nile inundation, while the surrounding agricultural fields were covered by the rising floodwaters of the Akat season. These canals led in straight lines to the various temples and shrines that dwelled on the west bank. The canals were not only transportation routes, but also fed the agricultural fields during the low season, filling the temple granaries each consecutive year with the harvest known as the Shemu season. Everything was monitored and measured precisely, and the Nilometers would provide the temple priests with the correct height of the Nile, allowing them to calculate how much land had been irrigated and thus how much land and crop would be subsequently harvested. This was all necessary in order to avoid a famine. The slightest mishap or miscalculation would bring chaos, which was personified as the god Seth. Everyone who was not of the higher class or royal household was either employed in the fields, temples, quarries, or one of the many associated infrastructures that went into the continuity of life, and all were working for the common good of the populace, in a divine collective worship for the living God, the Pharaoh. This, by the way, if you go to Giza today and look at the pyramids, they've uncovered in the recent 20 years the city there. Right there, a stone's throw from the pyramid. You could throw a softball and probably hit the outskirts of the town. That would have housed about 20,000 people. These were people who lived in that city for the sole purpose of building the pyramids. And they lived there, their families lived there, their offspring lived there, the next generation. So you can go visit that today. In terms of our interests, the important palace pertaining to our discussions was located at the end of the southern canal system, the palace of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, commonly known as the House of Rejoicing, home to not only one of Pharaoh's private harems, but also the official living quarters of the royal family. Had Pharaoh's private harems, and it was known as the House of Rejoicing. I'll bet it was. Let's see. In the 10th regnal year of Pharaoh Amenhotep's reign, he arranged a diplomatic marriage with Gelukhepa, the daughter of Shuturna, the second of Mitanni. Historical records have shown that she arrived in Thebes with the entire splendor, acquainted with the pharaoh's wife, but also with 317 attendants in tow. Today, however, very little remains. Low-lying mud brick walls protrude out of the desert floor, a stark reminder of what was once probably one of the most splendid palaces in Egypt, and home to some of ancient Egypt's most glorious historical figures: Pharaoh Akhenaten, Pharaoh Amenhotep III, Queen Tai, the daughter of great noble Yuya, and his ennobled wife Queen Tuya, and the crown prince Tutmosis, not to mention all other countless siblings and servants from Pharaoh's extensive harem. And this is the temple of Tutmosis III, standing before the tombs of the nobles in the Theban mountains. You can't see much here. There's not much, frankly, to see. But this is what you see of the Theban mountains in the background. That's the temple of Tutmosis III. Let's see. All right. The palace was extreme in every way for its day. Excavations began in 1888 with initial minor exploration of the site carried out by Georges Darcy. Later, it was carefully excavated by the British Egyptologist Percy E. Newberry, Rob Peister Titus, and again in the 1970s by Barry Kemp and David O'Connor. In the 1980s, a Japanese team uncovered dramatic ceilings that were painted with bright, colorful scenes of wild fowl and nature. The floors and doors were ornately decorated as well. The steps were covered with images of bound enemies of Egypt, commonly known then as the Nine Bows, so that the pharaoh walked upon them. He was symbolically crushing them beneath his feet. Sprawling across the desert's edge, the palace was immense, with chamber after chamber and associated with stores and servants' quarters. It was bounded into its eastern edge by the great lake of Birket Habu, Lake Malkata. This was a man-made lake, by the way. The whole area would have been electric. No matter where you gazed, there would be something to see. Oh, God, man, could you imagine going there? It would be so amazing to go back in time and just see what these places looked like when they were in their full glory. The whole area would have been electric. No matter where you gazed, there would be something to see. The royal princesses and their female courtiers, playing and frolicking by the water's edge of the Great Lake, while mocking the ever-watchful army of officers, the chariots of Pharaoh's private guard, racing along the canal's edge, checking on the sentries, the pharaoh accompanied by his royal entourage as he harpooned Nile perch while his male courtiers jostled for that small gesture of appreciation from their living god. The queen and her royal fan-bearers, her punkawallas, fanning her gently as she reclined majestically upon the gleaming Aten, and the royal princes as they raced their horses around the tracks of the desert floor. It would have been during this triumphant and splendid period that Moses could have witnessed the building of the House of a Million Years for Pharaoh Amenhotep III, his adopted grandfather, built and designed for him by the great architect Amenhotep, son of Hapu. That's, of course, in John's theory. Now, if we were to stand on the roof of the House of Rejoicing, we would be able to enjoy one of the most spectacular views that ancient history could afford us. Looking directly eastward, we would be able to make out the great temples of Karnak and Luxor on the east bank, with their associated canals and sphinx-lined avenues. Turning toward the north, we would view the small shrine to Queen Hatshepsut and Crown Prince Tutmosis, her temple that I showed you the pictures. Jesher would be off to the north of the palace. Looking directly eastward, we'd be able to make out the great, on Crown Prince Tutmosis. Lying within the grounds of the mound of creation, where the Ogdoad first appeared and created man from clay and fornicated with them to produce the children of the gods. To the northeast, we can clearly make out the tremendous temple of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, with the colossi statues, the big colossi of Memnon, standing guard over its entrance. These are all things you could stand at the palace and see all of these things spread out before you. We think of all these monuments that we've seen so many photographs and documentaries on. You could stand on the top of the palace, on the terrace, overlooking Lake Malkata, see the Theban mountains to your east, to the north, your left. You could see the Nile River about 3 miles, 2 to 3 miles out. from the palace. You could see all these temples in between, the Colossus of Memnon, the palaces to all these great pharaohs. You could see the temple to Hatshepsut. All of this stuff was laid out in a panorama before you over this man-made lake of Malkata, which was, the walls were about a mile by a mile and a half. It was something like that, this big lake. And they'd sail their ships off the canal, off the Nile. There'd be ships in there and boats and all kinds of things, all kinds of activity. Let's see, I lost my place because of that. You could see the temple, the step temple of Queen Hatshepsut as it climbs the sides of the Theban mountain, with its ornate pillared terraces and its central polished limestone stairway, ascending to its inner holiest of holies. To our left, there is the Theban mountain range as it rises out of the desert floor, sporadically intersected by small apertures, which would provide access to the private tombs of the nobles, the viziers of the past pharaohs, and the higher classes of the Egyptian elite, retelling the glorious stories of their owners on the walls in colorful relief and painted scenes of everyday life. Nestled to the southwest, this way, and hidden behind the escarpment, the Valley of the Queens, where the royal burials of the harems are located, is a much smaller affair than that of the Valley of the Kings, which, by the way, Hatshepsut was buried in the Valley of the Kings, not the Queens, because she was a pharaoh. No matter where we look, we see structures soaring toward the heavens, some colorful and some not, some shining so brightly in the outstretched arms of the sun god Ra that it is difficult to gaze upon them. If we turn further to our left and toward the south, we can see, that would be to our right in the south, once we turn around, facing west now, or left into the south, we can see the Theban mountain range as it continues southward, like a chain of mountain ridges with the open desert at its feet. Now, this isn't like the Rocky Mountains, folks. This is just a chain of ridges that run back and down to the south and the west of Luxor, with the open desert at its feet, making out the odd band of caravan travelers as they meander along the trade routes that connect Thebes with the southern nome of the modern-day Armant, where hopefully they can sell their wares. To the southeast, at the far end of Lake Malkata's embankments, the ramped station stands next to the lake's great feeding canal. This station, with its steep ramp and miniature obelisks, was built to receive Pharaoh Amenhotep III during his Sed festival, a jubilee to celebrate his first 30 years as the living god over Egypt. Now that you have a better understanding of the layout of ancient Thebes, it should not be too difficult to imagine Moses as the royal prince riding his chariot pulled by majestic horses alongside the canal from the banks of the river Nile to his adopted grandparents' palace, racing Tutmosis along the way, passing the fields of farmers and hurtling past the ceremonial procession of priests making their way to one of the houses of millions of years, carrying with them to the tabernacle the visiting god in his or her bark shrine, a small golden box with its ornately carved scenes and sacred texts, Nephthys and Isis at either end, their wings outstretched. Can you hear what I'm describing here? They would be carrying with them to the tabernacle the visiting god in his or her bark shrine, a small golden box with its ornately carved scenes and sacred texts, Nephthys and Isis at either end, their wings outstretched in a protective manner, while the shimmering box lay atop a small golden replica boat, suspended by golden poles that rest upon the priest's shoulders, bearing down the considerable amount of gold leaf that had been applied to all its surfaces. Ark of the Covenant is an Egyptian bark shrine. By the way, bark shrine carried on the shoulders of the priests from the walls of the Ramesseum in Luxor, Egypt. And I took this picture. If you can see here, you can make out all the priests down along the bottom here, and on their shoulders, the staffs and the small bark or boat. And on top of that, the gold box. On the feet It's got the winged characters over it. That is not the Ark of the Covenant. That is a bark shrine. Thebes would have been a tremendous sight, seeing the never-ending activity both on the east and west banks, fueled by the never-ending merchant ships that navigated the River Nile, or the desert caravans that entered Thebes from both the eastern and western deserts via the heavily trodden trade routes. These trade routes in the Nile River were the lifeblood of Thebes. And without them, Thebes would be no more than a small farming community, part of a larger principality that made up the kingdom of Egypt. It was these very routes that the quarried stone blocks would have been transported along, hundreds, if not thousands of workers, pulling a hard-woven rope of twine, all working as one cohesive unit to maneuver the blocks along these tracks. The mighty wooden sledges would be carrying the megalithic blocks of basalt, granite, limestone, sandstone, and other quarried stones that made up the funerary equipment and architectural details of the temples. Seeing one of these stone caravans emerge out of the eastern desert from the quarries of Wadi Harmamat would have been a sight that one could hardly imagine. The oxen in rows of 10 deep, harnessed to huge ropes and tackle, and behind them row after row of men with their backs bent as they pulled heavy upon ropes that lay across them like a spider's web, while men and women carrying pots of grease and oil would splash the path ahead and under the wooden sledge as it slowly moved along the clean, stony ground, bearing the immense weight of the stone on its wooden raft. The dust rising from such a train would be seen for miles, and the sounds could be heard across the desert floor to the outskirts of the Theban capital. Families began to line the streets to get a glimpse of their loved ones, throwing palm leaves and lotus petals at their feet, praying to the gods for their safe arrival. You know, at Gebel El Silsila, John and Maria's archaeological site, you can go up from the river in the quarries, you can go up the hill, you climb up these rocky, craggy hills, and you get to the top. And there is actually what they call the stone market up there. There's all these carved stones set out in rows, just for acres up on top of the hillside. And this is where they would haul the stone up there and they'd lay them out, and travelers would come along the trade route, building foremen, to purchase stone and have them shipped. And there was also a curbed path, 8 to 10 feet wide, that would go down the side of this mountain all the way down to the river. This curbed path had smooth stones on it, and it would step down sometimes a few inches and then flatten out again for 12 to 20 feet, all the way down, bringing you all the way down. And they would bring all these heavy stones down and load them onto boats on the river and ship them out. This is pretty neat. The eastern trade route would have been the choice for the Exodus. Now, this is according to John, providing them with a clearly marked route that eventually would have brought them to the shores of the Red Sea. Or they could have branched off and taken the northern route that hugged the eastern mountain range and eventually ended up emerging by the mouth of the Suez Canal. Either way, they would have ended their journey on the mainland at the same spot. This is worth remembering for future discussion within the later chapters. I talk about if they were in Thebes, John has them going one way out across the eastern desert to the wider expanse of the Red Sea. I have them up near Menepher or Memphis, the land of Goshen, where they would have lived as a slave people, taking the trade route, the Wadi Tumilat, all the way over, which deposited them at the Bitter Lakes at the north end of the Red Sea. So we'll hit both of those as we go. One of the main archaeological problems that today's scholars face is the lack of archaeological material that pertains to the existence or location of the Theban Acropolis, its town, its villages, and its suburbs. After years of excavation and clearing of accumulated debris, there's still no evidence to suggest the sprawling cities except for the workers' village at Deir el-Medina, which lies at the foot of the Theban mountains, which you can see from the remains of the palace. Many archaeologists archaeological investigations have been carried out here throughout the years with mountains of material recorded and documented, but alas, it does not shed light on the whereabouts of the main Theban city itself on the West Bank. The same can be said of the small settlements that have been located on the northeastern side of Karnak Temple on the East Bank. By my thinking, is because there wasn't much of a city there. This is one of the hinge pins of John's theory, is that Lake Malkata burst. And there is evidence of that. We know that happened. And that was the catalyst for what he describes as the 10 plagues. All the carnage after that destroyed the city. But there's no remains to the city that they can find. The reason we bring this up now is to add this question mark to the Theban map that we have tried to emulate for you. The missing component raises important questions when dealing with the Exodus and the alternative suggestions that we will explore later. But for now, it should be noted that even though we have all this splendid architecture and grand landscape, the actual towns and streets could have been located either on the West Bank or the East Bank, nestling between the various temple complexes. This has always been the suggested answer. And through the subsequent centuries, these dwellings have merely succumbed to their natural fate of destruction, caused by environmental erosion, and their remains reclaimed and reused in other building projects as time moved on. For me, it seems that Thebes was a center of religious worship, temple worship, monuments, and not so much the big cultural centers. The Theban necropolis was not inhabited by mass population, but was rather a royal and ceremonial center with its associated workers and priests. The annual floodwaters that rose with the inundation of the Nile must be taken into consideration when discussing the habitation of the common people. The low-lying lands that surround the temple complexes were indeed flooded during these high seasons. When Vivant Denon wrote his journal while accompanying French scientific exploration team during the latter part of the 18th century, he commented on the lay of the land, which he looked upon when he first arrived at Luxor. His maps clearly show a series of raised hills, on two of which the temples of Luxor and Karnak were built. The West Bank rises slowly toward the Theban mountains, thereby protecting the temples and the shrines that hug the western desert's edge. Could it be inconceivable to suggest that the same practice was employed for the smaller and common dwellings, building them upon the artificial platforms of debris and accumulated silt and other organic material? Later, during the mid-19th century, an English artist by the name of David Roberts painted a picture of the Colossi of Memnon, which were surrounded by water at the time. This would suggest that the protective levees that retained the rising waters behind them had indeed been eroded, allowing the swollen river to again gain further access across the low-lying lands. Could this erosion be the reason why we don't see any evidence of common habitation today? It is merely a theory, but plausible at the same time. Now, the inundation happened annually, and it doesn't happen anymore since they built the dam at Aswan. But this is David Roberts' painting of the Colossi of Memnon, and you can see the waters all around them. Those colossi face east, looking toward the Nile, and the Nile from the Colossi of Memnon are a good probably 1.5 miles to 2 miles from present-day river's edge. And there are ruins there, so the Nile went all the way out there. So that's the Colossi of Memnon. Let's see. Another theory or suggestion is that the commoners were possibly nomadic in their living styles, migrating back and forth as the river rose and sank with its annual seasons. This would provide us with the necessary answers as to why there are no remains today. But again, we don't have any evidence to support this theory. When we gaze upon the relief scenes that adorn the temples and tombs throughout Egypt, we do not see tents or nomadic dwellers. What we see are pillared courtyards with a surrounding structure that housed not only the owners, but their servants and stores as well. The courtyard almost always had a central water feature with a small garden and a plantation of trees at the entrance outside. There are various examples of this design, not only in relief, but also in scale models that were buried with the owners in the tombs of the nobles in Thebes, therefore suggesting that this type of housing actually existed, not only in the afterlife, but quite possibly during their lifetimes. But where? In an unpublished account, John describes some of his findings as he explored the limestone quarries. Now, this is John Ward, had written this. In the ancient limestone quarries of Pharaoh Hatshepsut that lie to the north of the Valley of the Kings, there is plentiful evidence to suggest they were inhabited after they became sources of usable limestone as building material. Their ceilings still bear the red painted lines, and I've been there, by the way, and seen this. This bust back here of Senenmut and Hatshepsut's daughter Nefertari. John had this made for me after we were writing this book. And this stone he had it made from, he took from the quarries of Hatshepsut. Just a big rock laying on the ground in a rocky region where her quarries were. And I've been there with John and seen the red markings that are still up there from 3,500 years ago for the quarrymen. On the walls in some of the galleries are the quarried caverns. We have observed early Christian graffiti in the form of white painted crosses, but again, no Hebrew symbolism. In one of the mud bricks, in one of these galleries, I have recorded and documented the use of fire brick and mud brick, used together to form as a basic form of habitation. It's worth mentioning that these quarries lie on the main trade route out of Thebes on the west bank, leading to the Farshut and Asyut regions of Egypt. From an historical point of view, these areas were close to the temple complex of Abydos and Dendera. There is no evidence to suggest that these quarries were used as places of refuge or habitation during the Pharaonic period, but during the Greco-Roman period instead. However, they do provide us with a great example of how existing sites were reused for shelter and security. Over the many years I've researched ancient symbolism in Egypt, I've been fortunate to explore most of the Theban area, and this includes the mountainous terrain and trade routes and valleys that dwell within the Theban mountains that contain a wealth of archaeological material, including inscriptions of dedications, adorations, mere name graffiti, and pictorial drawings. However, I have yet to come across any symbols or associated inscriptions that pertain to a Hebrew connotation or relation. With all the various temples and shrines, canals, the Great Lake, and not to mention the thousands of tombs, the workforce that would have been needed to facilitate all these grand buildings, programs over the centuries would have been immense. But alas, we do not have the common graves of workers of the time. We do not have their individual dwellings outside the workers' village. They just do not exist. Well, not yet, anyway. Maybe yet to be discovered, buried beneath meters of sand and debris, like Luxor Temple was before the sands of time were removed. That was from John Ward's journals. Luxor Temple, and by the way, I believe you don't find any Hebrew remains in Luxor because they weren't there. They were north. They were up in Mennefer, in Goshen, Avaris, Pi-Ramses. Luxor Temple, before it was excavated, was buried almost up to the height of the inner courtyards. If one looks carefully today, one can still make out the post holes on the exterior and interior walls that once held the floor and ceiling timbers of the Christian and later Muslims that built their houses abutting the grand temple walls. The mosque that we mentioned earlier is located above the temple itself, sitting upon the pillars that stand in the first courtyard, with a doorway that now leads to nowhere. As the debris has now been removed, one can freely walk through the inner courtyard at its original ground level. What if the houses and mass burials of the common folk lie undisturbed beneath the modern city of Luxor today? It's a maybe, a possibility. However, during the years of construction, no other remains have been discovered as of yet. Most of Egypt has a plethora of ancient sites that provide us with a wealth of material that deals primarily with the religious aspects of its society and the royal households, but no pharaonic villages or cities have yet been discovered. There are plenty of examples, however, of Greco-Roman architecture, so this does beg the question, where did they all live? Where did the Hebrews, the so-called slaves of Egypt, live? In the north. When all is said and done, it is worth asking, when thinking about the Great Exodus, where did they all come from? This leads to the next question, where did they all live? And where did the Hebrews spend their days in bondage? Was it in Goshen in the north? Or were they spread throughout the entire land of Egypt? But before we dig in, let's take a look at the continuing, sometimes not so friendly dialogue between faith and academia. And that will be chapter 2, which we'll hit tomorrow. Chapter 2 is entitled, Faith in Fact is Not Fact, It's Faith. And that's a fact. And you can bet your faith on it. So that's what we'll read tomorrow night. I want to show you a couple of other pictures here, because we mentioned the inundation. Let's see where I had that in the pictures here. Some portions of what we just read. Oh, Lake Malkata. I have some pictures in here. Here it is. I want to show you something. Here's the Nile River. This is a map. I'm going to grab something to point with here. And again, I wish I could do this better than this. So hopefully you can see this. This is Luxor, all this area. Over here you have the Theban Mountains. This is the Nile River with the islands. John's house would have been somewhere right about here. The Temple of Karnak and Luxor. Look at this if I can read it. I think this is the French map. Yeah, here you go. This is the Temple of Luxor down here. Temple of Karnak up here. This structure right here, this big wall, this is Lake Malkata. It was an inland lake built by the pharaoh. And the pharaoh's palace is up in here. And Deir el-Bahre is back in here. And all these temples I told you about are all lined up in here in front of the Theban Mountains. So, there you go. And this is Lake Malkata today. This is what it looks like. Now, if you, I want to show you a little diagram here. Again, this would be so helpful if I could put them up here. This is what Lake Malkata would have been like. It would have been structured like this. And I built in kind of a 3D image of the lake as it would have been built. But it broke open here and all the water gushed out here. And there's all the remains of that. But built up all around here now, these corners are the cities of Qom, little villages, as you see. I'll show you in the next picture. These are some of the walls, John and me, at the walls of the Great Lake. And we would have been right down in this corner where we took that picture, the village of Qom. And this is just a picture of a sacred lake that was inscribed on a wall. This is what Lake Malkata looks like today. This is the village of Qom. All these walls, the oldest towns, you can barely drive a car through there. But this is John on a rooftop of a friend of ours looking across the lake. He's standing right about, here, looking across the lake to the palace over here. But this is that great fertile expanse that was once the lake. And it's still a big rectangle. And the palace is out here. And the ruins of some of the nobility. Same here. And we're up on the houses, the local houses here, looking out across the field toward the Sahara. And this is the edge of the Theban Mountains as you see them here. So this is Lake Malkata today, looking out in both these pictures from right about here. Not up here, I'm sorry, I'm looking at it backwards on my screen. From right about here out across into the Theban Mountains. And then the desert spreads out this way, because these mountains trail off in this direction. And so you see the open expanse of desert there. So that's Malkata. That's where this would have taken place. And this is what you see, by the way. Back here is the temple of Menedat Habu that we spoke about. This is all the ruins of what's left today of the temple complex of Amenhotep III, right here. And right across from this, we're just sitting right across this dirt road right here, where there's stones from this temple. We're sitting at a little open-air cafe, eating lunch where we went every day, and right across from the ruins of the temple of Amenhotep III. So John and I, maybe one of these days, will do another trip, taking people to Egypt. We did one back in 2014 where we took about 15 people with us. So there's the Colossus of Memnon, by the way. These two statues. You've seen them in paintings and pictures. And this is John's guy for Pharaoh, or for Moses, I'm sorry, Amenhotep, son of Hapu. And he lays his case out in the book. So there you go. Tomorrow, we're going to hit the next chapter about the faith that's behind that. I remember John and I walking, and we've got 9 minutes before Rocky and I go on. So I'll just take a minute. We were walking, and John said, as we were walking up Serabit el Khidim in the Sinai, he said, you know, Scotty, he says, this trip has done one thing for me. This was the trip back in 2013 researching. He said, it's kind of reignited elements of my faith. And that's what this will do when you're there and you see it and you say, this was real. Things happened here. And so we'll get into that more and more. So thanks for listening tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. Go visit my site, scottallenroberts.com. You can see all my stuff there. You can, I do have a box of these books sitting down here. I don't have John here to sign them, but I can inscribe them. If you'd like one of these, inscribe, just write me on my Facebook, send me a message somewhere, and we'll work it out, how to make that happen. And I can ship a book out to you if you want one of these for your very own. So thanks for being here. We'll see you tomorrow night. See you in about 8 minutes with Rocky Stucci in the Situation Room. And I'm going to go splash my face to try to stay awake and get some more coffee. And I'll see you in a few. Have a good night. See you tomorrow.